Hello, everybody. Welcome to Empower. I hope you've been enjoying the conference, and welcome to Building Better Relationships. My name is Benjamin. I will be your presenter for today. Before I hop into my presentation, I want to walk through a few housekeeping items. First thing to note is this session is being recorded. So it is a 45-minute session, and we will have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. However, if you need to go and review anything I said, if you want to try to build along with anything that I showed you during this session, this recording will be available afterwards. Second, since I've mentioned Q&A, there is a Q&A portion of Zoom and there's a chat portion. Please feel free to chat in if you just want to respond to any rhetorical questions I have. If you want to exchange ideas with your fellow participants, you can just switch the chat function from two panelists over to two panelists and attendees, and use the Q&A to park questions for me to answer at the end of the 45 minutes. And one last thing, I love feedback. I'd love to know how this session was. Additionally, there's a bunch of content that I would love to pack into this, but unfortunately couldn't do it within the 45-minute window. So at certain points, I'll mention additional topics that I think could be interesting and are related to what we're talking about here. And if you're interested in those, please let me know in the feedback. With that being said, let's take a look at building better relationships. So here's the agenda I've got for us today. First, I'll take a moment to tell you about who I am and why it's me talking to you today. Then I want to help you understand if this session is right for you. There's a lot going on with Empower this week. There are many sessions. And I want to make sure that you are sitting here watching this, tuning in for a reason. So I want to walk through questions you can ask yourselves to help identify if this is a good session for you. Then we're going to get into the topic itself. So I'm going to talk about relationships at a high level just to refresh anyone's memory. And then I'm going to talk about lineage. It's an unofficial concept, but one that we like to teach in QuickBase University to help people understand how their relationships and their apps could be better. Now, along with lineage comes the topic of potentially unnecessary relationships, or as I've marked it here, unnecessary relationships with an asterisk. From there, like any topic, there's always some exceptions. And in this case, the exception to lineage and unnecessary relationships is conditional dropdowns. So I'll walk you through what those are in case you haven't heard of them, or maybe you have, but you're not really sure what they are. Then I want to do a live demonstration to show you how you can apply some of the concepts of lineage and avoiding unnecessary relationships. That'll take us through about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So let's get this show on the road. Just a quick bit about myself. You're seeing me here twice now. This is me on video, and that's me in a picture. My name is Benjamin Buday. I'm a senior product trainer here at QuickBase. And next month, sometime early July, will be my 7th anniversary of being a QuickBase employee. So thanks for having me for these 7 years. I look forward to at least another 7. Enough about me. Let's talk about the topic that you're here to tune in for. So first, how do I know this session is right for me? Well, let me walk you through what this session is really all about. QuickBase is comprised of several layers, just like any database is. One of the most important layers is the user interface and the user experience layer. That's where users log in and see the app. They add data, modify data, view data, gain insights. And all of the icons you see on the screen here, reports, pages, forms, charts, those are all user interface and user experience. There's a whole nother layer of logic as well. That's the gray icons, webhooks, automated emails, pipelines, permissions. Now, those two layers all sit on top of a structure layer, a data layer. So your fields and your relationships and your tables. And the reason I bring all of this up is the structure of an app, the fields, the relationships, and the tables are going to influence if the app is useful, if it's efficient, and if it's intuitive. And if your app has any unnecessary or incorrect relationships or just otherwise not correct structural elements, the app might not be as useful or as efficient or as intuitive as you want it to be. So that's to say that all the features above the little line there aren't really going to fall into place easily unless you have the fields and the relationships and the tables, that foundation, solid underneath. So here are some questions that you can ask yourselves. And I would say that if you say yes to any or several of these, then this session is probably good for you. Are you unsure about any of the relationships in one or more of your apps? Think about some of the apps that maybe you manage that you didn't build, but now you've inherited. Are any of those relationships maybe seemingly not necessary? In those apps, do you have any child records that seemingly should have parent records but don't? Do you have drop-down fields and add buttons that just don't seem to work the way you expect them to? Is redundant data entry required in order to link records from different tables? Do you find yourself doing the same thing maybe more than once in order to connect records from different tables? Are there reports that just can't seem to bring the right columns together? Are you conflicted on how to construct your next app's tables and relationships? Are you working on an app right now or trying to reformulate one and you just feel like you're stuck on the relationships part of it? Or, as I mentioned before, did you inherit an app and maybe you think that it has incorrect relationships? So feel free to use the chat. Would love to see how people are feeling about this. If any of these questions describe your situation, or if you find yourself saying, yeah, I think so, or definitely yes to any of these, then I think this session is going to be right for you. With that, let me just go through a few relationship basics to set up the premise for building better relationships. So relationships simplify data entry and reporting, and way more, but that's a nice, concise way to just sum it up. Here's what QuickBase does when you create a relationship between two tables. Let me give you an example here. Let's say that you have a table for job applications and another table for interviews. So maybe your app is a hiring and recruiting app. Now, as candidates log job applications, as they apply for jobs, at some point, the team that is hiring is going to ideally interview these candidates, and probably many times. So there's a table for job applications, a table for interviews, and there's likely a one-to-many relationship to say that for each application, ideally, we're going to interview that candidate many times. So we'll have many interviews logged against that application. So QuickBase calls the applications table, in this case, the parent, and it calls the interviews table the child. So with any relationship, you have a parent and a child. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And when you create that relationship, QuickBase gives you some features right off the bat, and then allows you to create some additional features, some special fields, because you have that relationship. So on the parent table, what you get right away, what's provided for you as soon as you create the relationship, is an add child button. It's a formula URL, but it's a button that allows you to add those interviews right to an application. And you get a report link that's going to show you those interviews embedded so that when you look at an application, you can see all of the interviews and interview notes right there. Now on the child table, you would get a reference field and a reference proxy. And while you may not really think about these much, essentially when you're looking at an interview record, there's a field that shows you which parent job application it's tied to. And the field, the reference field, I should say, and the reference proxy work together to provide you with that interface and that information. They provide that connection. Now, you also have the ability to create some additional fields. You can create summary fields on the parent table to summarize information about the interviews so that when you look at a job application, you can see how many interviews have been conducted and maybe how many more you want to conduct. On the child table, you get the option for lookup fields. So basically anything about the application that we should see when logging the interview, like the candidate's name, the job they're applying for, maybe when they applied, the department that job is in, is sitting right there as you log your interview notes. Now to show you what this would look like, I've constructed an app and I've taken some snapshots. So again, the job applications table, the parent is on the left. In the interviews table, the child is going to be on the right. So let's take a look at what this looks like. On the left, we have an application from Haley Goldstein. And on the right, we have an interview record that we're logging for Haley's application. So someone is interviewing Haley and wants to add some interview notes. Now, here are the features that I mentioned on the previous slide. The Add Child button is over there on the left. I've colored it fuchsia so you can see it right there. That's that Add Child button that was given to you automatically. And that's your report link. It shows all of the interviews that have already been conducted for Haley. On the right side, the child table, we've got the reference proxy. It's this drop down here, and it's standing in for the reference field. Chances are, if a person went and clicked Add Interview, they wouldn't really have to touch that application ID field on the right at all. It would just be auto-filled. And all the fields around it, like the name of Haley, Haley's name is another way to say that, the position that she's applied for, the rec ID, the department, all of that is just being pulled in via lookup fields. So those are the basics of relationships. And the reason I bring this up is once people learn how these relationships work, they see the features that they get when they build a relationship, and then they sort of do a one-to-one connection in their minds. If I want to have those buttons, if I want to see those report links, if I want tables to trade information, I guess I have to relate them, right? Has that been anybody's assumption before? What I'm here to tell you about, though, is that you don't always have to connect two tables in order to have them trade information. That's the essence of building better relationships. And really, that's the essence of Lineage. It's not an official term. I don't think you'll see it if you search the help docs. But Lineage is a great way to describe how tables that aren't directly related can still trade information. So let me walk you through this concept of lineage. And to do this, I'm going to show you just a snippet of a data model here. This data model looks like it symbolizes and stands for an app that is like a CRM. There's a table for tracking companies or customers, a table for tracking contacts, and a table for tracking interactions or activities with said contacts. Now, the idea of lineage is that lineage is a sequence of relationships between different sets of tables. So we're looking at an instance of lineage here, from companies to contacts to activities. And lineage means that you can leave tables that don't actually need a direct connection unrelated. And there's a dotted arrow here showing companies and activities have an indirect relationship. And what I'm saying is, with the concept of lineage, you don't need to relate companies directly to activities, though you may think you want them to trade information, and maybe they should. Lineage basically helps us remove and avoid these potentially unnecessary relationships. And let me walk you through now what I mean by unnecessary relationship. In order to understand this, let's take that parent and child nomenclature that I mentioned earlier, and let's think about with lineage, the idea that a company's table in this case is sort of like a grandparent to the activities, which is sort of like a grandchild. Now, a table is not inherently a parent or a child just because of the table itself. A table like contacts, in this case, is a child to companies, but it's also a parent to activities. So with that in mind, let's look at what potentially unnecessary relationships really means. And let's pop that example back up on screen. This is the relationship that I'm saying is potentially unnecessary. I'll redo that animation so you can see that again, but that dotted line there connecting companies and activities. Now, why would someone want to relate those in the first place? Well, you may want to look at a company record and see what are all the activities we've had with all of the contacts for this customer. You may want to see when's the last time, the date and time that we spoke to any of the contacts at this company. And of course, when you're looking at the actual activities themselves, you probably want to see the name of the contact, who the activity was with, and that person's company. So it makes sense that you would want them to trade information, right? But you don't need to relate those directly. And I'd be curious to know, just using the chat, if you know that you've connected tables like this before, and maybe you felt like that wasn't necessarily necessary, go ahead and chime in. But here's why I say this is unnecessary. Let's take the contacts out of the equation. So let's just remove those for a second. Would you ever log an activity with a company, customer, but not with a contact? So would you ever add an activity and choose the company, but not say who the contact you had that activity with was? Like, what would that look like? Having an activity with a company, but not a person. Now you could have an activity with many contacts. In that case, you could create a many-to-many relationship and add another table in between activities and contacts. But it doesn't seem like you would ever really add an activity with a company without specifying who at that company you interacted with. Let me provide another example. And this example is close to my heart, close to my job, because it is my job. Same looking data model, but this time we now have a table for trainers, a table for events, and a table for participants. And I'm saying that you probably would not want to relate trainers and participants. That would be the unnecessary relationship. Now, for me, there are reasons why I would want to have participant information up at the trainers table. If we have the participants leaving feedback, I might want to see that feedback when I look at a trainer's record. And when I look at the participant records, they're sort of like enrollment records, right? Well, I'd want to see who the trainer was for the event that that person attended. But I'm saying that this direct connection, this relationship between trainers and participants is likely not necessary. And why is that? Well, same thing with the CRM example before. Let's take the middle table, the events, out of the equation. I wouldn't add a participant just directly to a trainer without specifying the event that they attended. So this is a pretty surefire way, I won't say 100%, but pretty close way to identify if you really need that relationship or not. There is an exception coming up, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you don't think that you would need to log a participant directly to a trainer, if they're always going to be logged against an event that the trainer led, then you probably don't need this direct connection here. And if you want to know why you shouldn't build it, think of the 7 questions that I asked you before. If you have add child buttons, if you have reports that just don't seem to be coming together, or if you have to enter in data redundantly to connect records from different tables, those can be signs of unnecessary relationships, like this one between trainers and participants. Lineage can pretty much provide you with everything that you need in these scenarios. So back with my trainers, events, participants example, Lineage is served by lookups of lookups. And so what that means is if I have a trainer name field on the trainers table, a lookup field pulls that down to the events table. So each event can see which trainer led it. And then a lookup of that lookup can pull the information down to the participants table. So I can look at a participant and see which event they attended and who the trainer was for that event. Lineage is also served by summaries of summaries, taking a summary field in one relationship and in another relationship summarizing that summary field. For example, at the participants level, we might ask for a net promoter score, basically 0 through 10. How did you like this session? Or would you recommend this session to another friend or colleague? Now, I might want to see that information, of course, at the event level, so I can see what was the average NPS, net promoter score, for that event. How did we do overall? But then I may also want to see, okay, let's look at the trainer level. What is that trainer's net promoter score average overall? Lineage allows us to do this without having to relate trainers directly to participants. Now, where a lot of folks tend to know that much if they've been building for a while, here's the one that sometimes eludes us. Let's wipe the slate clean for a moment here. Custom report links. I'll define that in a little bit, but custom report links would allow us to do something like this. If we're capturing feedback at the participants level, which I hope to capture with this session here that you're attending, we may want to see all of the feedback for all events that a single trainer has led. So not just have the trainer go through and look at all the events one by one, but just be able to look at their own record and see, here's the feedback that I've been receiving for all of the events I've ever led. So earlier I mentioned exceptions. There's really one, so let's talk about it now. And this is one of the topics that I won't have enough time to define fully. So right now, if you know this is something you want to learn more about, let us know in the feedback. Please, of course, let us know how you felt about this session in and of itself, but let us know if you'd like to see more. And if you're not really sure what I'm talking about, in about 3 minutes, hopefully you'll have an idea. And if you think that's something you want to learn about, let me know. So on to conditional dropdowns, also known as when that relationship is actually okay. So is that relationship ever necessary? If we come back to the CRM, the customer relationship management example, is it ever okay to relate companies and activities directly? Well, if you would ever have an activity with a company, sure. But barring that, if we've remove that scenario, there's still one other reason you may want that relationship. If you want your workflow to start from a certain place, specifically in this case from the activities table, you might need this relationship. So let me walk you through it, because you may want a conditional dropdown. What does that mean? This is a conditional dropdown. Let's say that you want to start your workflow for adding an activity, for logging an interaction with a customer at the activities table. So you've decided, I want my users to have a button that just says add activity right on their home screen. First thing they see, add activity. Great. So they click add activity. The next thing they need to do, type in a subject, maybe some other information, but they need to pick the company or the customer that they had that activity with. So in this case, we'll pick QuickBase as the company. Now, once they pick that, below that, they want to choose the contact's name. And here's the kicker. They want to make sure that you're only seeing contacts for the company that you chose. In this case, QuickBase. So let me rewind a bit and walk through that again. If you want to start by clicking add activity, you choose the company, and by choosing the company, you filter the contacts that you can choose from to only show contacts that work for that company. Is this something you want? In this case, you want a conditional dropdown, and you likely do want that relationship that I've been saying is generally unnecessary. There's a little more to it than just setting it up like that, and there are going to be some considerations. So again, if you want to learn more about this, let me know in the feedback, and we'll have another session available in QuickBase University to go all through conditional dropdowns. But here's your checklist essentially for how to decide, do you build that relationship or not? So 3 data models here. Take a moment to look at them, because the 2 on the sides here, the left and the right, are the same one. They're the CRM. The one in the middle is actually one for a project management app. So they look similar, but just look at the actual words in them and just note that the 2 on the side are the same and the one in the middle is not. So here's your checklist in your guidelines. Starting from the left, if your workflow starts at the activities table and you want that conditional dropdown that I just showed you, add an activity, pick the company, have that filter which contact you can pick, then you want to create that, as I've said otherwise, unnecessary relationship. Next, in the center, for projects and tasks and comments, if you would actually add a comment directly to a project without necessarily adding it to a task within that project, then you're saying that, yeah, a project could actually have comments itself in addition to tasks having comments. So go ahead and create that extra relationship. That's a relationship that you actually need. But if neither of those is true, and from what I've seen, chances are, more often than not, those 2 are not true, you don't need that relationship. And building better relationships is all about figuring out which relationships just aren't needed and removing them so that you remove extra buttons and calls to action and redundant fields. So with that in mind, we've talked a lot hypothetically. Let me actually show you an example of how this works in action. So demo time. Here's the situation. I'm going to use the ever classic property management. You've probably seen that in QuickBase University if you've taken any of the trainings. So with this example here, here's my data model. I have a buildings table, I have an apartments table, I have a leases table. And I have a relationship so that buildings can have many apartments and apartments can have many leases. What I've said so far is essentially a relationship between buildings and leases is not necessary because I'm not going to have people leasing buildings. In my property management scenario, people are leasing my apartments and those apartments belong to buildings. So we want to add leases to apartments. We don't need to add leases directly to the buildings. However, we probably want to see building and apartment info on each lease, right? You don't just need to see the unit number that you're renting. You need to see the address, the building's name if it has one itself, the building manager or the property manager. And when you view a single building, and as part of my organization, you may want to be able to see all of the open leases for that building. So if you're looking at a building, single record here, you might want to see the apartments as like an inventory, but you'd probably also want to see the current leases and the tenants that are actually leasing those apartments, right? So we do want to see information from buildings and leases cross-pollinate. but we don't want to add leases directly to buildings and give ourselves unnecessary connections and calls to actions. So here's what it will look like, and pardon the multiple arrows here, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you how to create lookups of lookups so that we can bring building data all the way down to the leases table. So each lease will understand its grandparent building. Then I'm going to create some summaries of summaries so that we can bring lease info up to the buildings table. Then I'm going to show you how to create a custom report link so that when we look at a single building, we can see the grandchild leases without having to build an unnecessary relationship between buildings and leases. So if you're ready, strap in, because here we go. It's demo time. Now, again, this is being recorded, so I'm not going to necessarily go at a pace where you could build along with me. But if you want to check out this recording later and you want to follow along and try this out, here's where you can go to get my app from the Exchange. When you're logged in to QuickBase and you're on the My Apps page, and just note that I'm zoomed in a little bit to make sure that you don't have to squint to see the words on my screen. Your screen will look a little different probably. But on your My Apps page, look in the upper right. You have an Explore Sample Apps button. Or if you're in a Builder program account, if you have a Builder account, you'll just see a single word that says Exchange on the right. So whichever verbiage you have, you can click that and you can search for the terms Training Companion. And the app that I've supplied, that I'm using and I already have a copy of, is this one that's called Training Companion Property Management. So you can feel free to acquire that app, but for now, I'm not going to necessarily move at a pace where you'd be able to keep up with me. So it might make sense to just watch here, confirm that this is what you want to learn, and then go back to the recording and try this on your own. And if you're watching this during the recording, then welcome back, and I hope this is useful for you. But for now, let's walk through the app. I'm going to show you just a few of the tables. I don't want to show you everything, but I have buildings and apartments and leases. I also have tenants off to the side, but we're not going to really focus on that one for now. With these buildings, I just have two just to keep it simple. And we can see here that if I open up this one building called Cambridge Lofts, this building has many apartments. 7 of them are vacant, 4 of them are occupied. If I take a look at the apartments themselves, here we go. Here are all the apartments. I can look at any given apartment, like, let's look at this one here. And I can see, okay, there's a status. Here's information about the unit itself, information about the parent building, and information about the lease itself as well. Now, if I go and actually look at a lease though, so let's find an apartment that has a lease. If I can't find one right now, I'll just go ahead and go over to the leases table, and that's an easy way to do it too. So if I look at this one here, here we go. Here's an occupied apartment. And so let me edit this apartment so you can see what fields are what. It looks like the status is manual entry, so you pick from a drop down here. This lease here for Peter Parker started years ago, and it ends in 2021. So it is a current lease. But if I actually go and look at that lease itself, well, by default here, there's some information that's missing. I can see the name of the person. I can actually see the address here. I can see the unit number and the lease information, of course, but I don't actually see the building name. And maybe that's fine, but imagine you're a new employee working for this company. You may not necessarily know which building is which, so it would probably be useful to have the name of the building on the leases table. Kind of like we have the address. The address is technically a lookup of a lookup. So let's pull the building name down as well. For some people who've been building for a while, you may already know how to do this, but we're going to ramp up the complexity in a little bit. So stay tuned. So let's go to the buildings table first so that we can look at the relationship between buildings and apartments, and so that we can confirm what buildings is passing down to apartments. If I look in the settings here, and then if I head over to the table of relationships, I can see there's one relationship between buildings and apartments. And if I open that relationship, here are all the special relationship fields that we get when we take a look at the buildings and apartments relationship. So, okay. It looks like this app builder, it was me, said that the building name was going to be the key field. That doesn't necessarily matter for this lesson here, but it's good to note. And so each apartment understands that the building's name is what to refer to so that an apartment knows which building it's connected to. Okay, so the apartments know the building name, and we actually saw that before. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my apartments relationships so I can look at the relationship between apartments and leases. And I'm going to create a lookup field in that relationship to take advantage of Lineage and pull the building name all the way from buildings down to apartments, down to leases. So I'm just going to click on building settings in the upper left here to just quickly switch between my table settings. I'll find apartments here and click that. And on the apartment settings table, I will open the relationships. And so here we can see apartments is sort of in the middle here. It's both a child to buildings and a parent to leases. So we'll open up the apartments and leases relationship. Now we can see if we look on the, well, it's not the right, but it's the information that is rightmost on the screen, right? Here we have the child table of leases, and we can see each lease understands which apartment it belongs to. It understands the unit number of said apartment or unit, and it understands the apartment's building's address, but it doesn't know the building's name. Now, I don't have to relate leases directly to buildings in order to just click add lookup fields and say, I want to pull down the building name. Now I have a feeling my video is obscuring an important button that I need to click on here, so I'm going to slide it over a little bit. Not sure if that's going to come through on your side, but it does on mine. So I'm going to click create. Great. Now I can see apartment dash building name. I might want to rename that, or I could just relabel it on my form, but that is now on the leases table here. And if I go and exit my settings, which I'll do now, and go over to the leases table and take a look at one of these current leases, well, any lease really, but let's look at a current one for, let's go find Peter again. Now we're going to see, aha, this is for Cambridge Lofts, right there. Now with a little bit of fine tuning and adjusting, I can customize the form, make it look a little bit better than this and say, let's see, I want the apartment building name to be up near the address, and I just want it to say building. And okay, with a few little changes here, I'll click save. And already this is a little bit more descriptive for me. So that's a lookup of a lookup. Chances are some of you already know how to do this, right? Let's now move on to a summary of a summary. Let's say that we want to look at a building and see how many leases there are that are current. We don't know how many current leases there are. If we can extrapolate that, we could probably also extrapolate how many are expiring or how many are maybe upcoming. They haven't started yet, but they're about to. Now, what you should know about the leases is that I do have a formula as my status field. So this status here is not something that I have to actually set myself. It changes based on the dates in the lease end and the lease start. And I won't go into teaching you about formulas, but basically what we see here is an if statement saying, okay, in relation to today's date and the start date and the end date, here are all of the conditions. Here are the statuses that a lease could be. It could be upcoming, it could be expired, it could be expiring soon, it could be current. So I didn't make any changes. I'm just going to cancel and exit my settings. That's all to say that if we pretended that Peter's lease doesn't end in August 2021, it actually ends, well, let's put in sometime really soon. Let's put in June 6th. Still thinks it's current, okay, right? But if we get a little bit closer, it's expiring soon. So that's all to say that this status is automatic. With that in mind, let's just summarize the current leases. So there are 3 current leases here. We're going to summarize that up so that when we look at the buildings, and I believe these all belong to one building here, but we'll find out, it'll show us that there are 3 current leases. Again, it could be useful to show which ones are expiring or maybe upcoming. It would be good to have that figure, especially in a report. So let's take a look at the relationship between leases and apartments first. Let's make sure that each apartment has that information because we want to use the sequence of relationships, that lineage, to move that information up and summarize a summary field. So into my relationships, specifically the apartments to leases relationship. Okay, so on the left, I have this option to add summary field. I'm going to click that. And I have a few options, actually more than a few, but at the top, I have just a couple of options to start. With this radio button here, I can decide, am I going to summarize the number of leases directly related to an apartment, or am I going to summarize a particular field? So I'm going to summarize the number of leases related to an apartment, but I'm going to use matching criteria down below to say only summarize records where the status of the lease is equal to current. And I have to type it in because it's a formula field, not a drop-down field. Now, it's probably not that useful to see if an apartment has a current lease or not. It's either leased or going to be leased or not. But we could actually maybe think about having the apartment status base itself on how many upcoming or current or expired leases it has. There's a lot of ways to automate. That could be one of them. So it may not make total sense in the apartments table right now, but it's a means to an end. So I'll say I'm going to create this and call it number of current leases. I'll click OK. Now, each apartment has a figure. It knows how many current leases it has assigned to it. Technically, you probably only have one unless the tenants are signing their own leases, but you could also have one that's currently about to expire and one that's about to start, and they could both be considered current depending on your nomenclature. But now that the apartments knows how many current leases there are, I'm going to push that using another summary field up to the buildings table. To do that, I'm going to go over to the buildings tables settings and into the relationships. So at the buildings tables settings, I'm going to look down at the table-to-table relationships. It only has one, so let's open that one up. And I'm going to click Add Summary Field. This time, I don't want to summarize the number of apartments related to the building. That's not the purpose. I want to summarize a specific field. I want to get the total for the field, number of current leases for all of the apartments that belong to that building. And I don't need matching criteria because that summary field already has its matching criteria and filtering baked into it. So I'm just summarizing that already filtered summary field, right? Now I'm going to click Create, and I'll rename it to just say number of current leases. That's fine, and hit OK. Awesome. So I have a summary of a summary. I have lease information up at the buildings table, and with lookups of lookups, I have building information down at the leases table, and I didn't have to directly connect them. Now, if I exit my settings and head over to the buildings table, we can see this in action. Let's go pull up the Cambridge Lofts, which I think has, 3 current leases. Now, if you're really eagle-eyed, you may have noticed that I have 4 occupied apartments, but 3 current leases. So I'm guessing that at some point I didn't fully check to see if all of these apartments are accurately tagged with a status. Like if I look through all 4 of them, here's one that's occupied, that has a current lease. Here's another one that's occupied, it has a current lease, that's Peter's. Here's another one that's marked as occupied. Oh, but this lease ended. So it might be kind of useful to have this status maybe be informed by the number of current leases or upcoming leases, right? Maybe something to think about, some automation options, some possibilities to expand. But I'm just going to go correct this one and mark it as vacant. We'll get back to the lesson, but I wanted to make sure that all of that looked realistic. So back to the Cambridge Lofts table, great. 3 current leases, 3 occupied apartments. But here's the final piece that I find confounds most builders. I want to see those current leases. How do I do that? And oftentimes builders get stuck because it's not necessarily just a few clicks away, so they create a relationship between buildings and leases. You don't have to do that. What we do have to do is create a report link. And it's worth understanding how these report links work. So rather than walk you through the whole history of the report link, I'll just show you how to create one and you can do some further reading or let me know in the feedback if you want more report link training to talk about exactly what's going on. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a report link field to my buildings table. Just like this apartments report link here, it's gonna be a window into the leases that matter to this building, the grandchild leases. So I could go into my settings and add that field, but all the same, I can also just right click next to the number of current leases and say that I wanna add a field after this one. So if you didn't know about that shortcut, that's a cool one. Right click on a field and you can add another field right after it. Coolest part of this is that you can actually create a brand new field right from this. So I'm going to create a new field. I'm going to call it leases, and it's going to be a report link type of field. So you can search for report link or just type in REP and it should pull up. Might be a little bit different on a Mac, but there we go, report link. Great, that's step one. When I click done, I might think that I did this wrong because it says broken link. Whoops, well, I actually just haven't told it what to do yet. It doesn't know to look at the leases just because I called it leases. I have to direct it very pointedly. So what I'm going to do is going to right click on leases so that I can edit the field properties for this new report link field using this option right at the bottom. Now, what matters is the report link field options in this field relationship. This is what QuickBase does for you automatically when you create a relationship. So it makes sense that people just want to create the relationship to get this to work. But you can set this up yourself. So all of these words here match the values in the field from this table to the values in this field. Basically say, okay, building that the user is looking at, go show the leases that matter to you. So we need to find a commonality in the data. What do buildings know about themselves that the grandchild leases also know about the building? How about that building name lookup of a lookup that I just created a few minutes ago? Yeah, each lease knows which grandparent building it belongs to. So let's connect them. So what we're gonna do is on the left, say the matching criteria on this table is building name. And to go find the leases table's building name field, I'm going to click select target. Now, for some of you, if you're following along with the recording, or if you tried to jump in live and do it with me now, if you don't see anything when you click, if you clicked a few times and you see nothing, look up in your address bar, right up here, up to the right. If you use Chrome like me or other browsers, your browser might be blocking a pop-up. So you may need to click that icon and allow pop-ups from QuickBase. I promise they won't be annoying. Now, I can see all of the fields in this app. And what you may notice is there aren't really any separators for the tables. It's just showing me all of the fields with the table name as sort of like a prefix. And it's got them not in alphabetical order necessarily, but in chronological order. So I'm going to go through buildings, apartments. I'm looking for leases, apartment, building name. Okay, that's the one I want. Now, if you're following along at home with the recording, one thing you can always do is go find that destination field, if you will, on the leases table and maybe rename it temporarily like grandparent building name so that you know exactly what to look for. Then you can go back and name it to something else when you're done. So we're saying on the buildings table, this report link should take the name of the building, go look at the leases and find the leases that have the same building name. Awesome. That's step two. I'm going to save. It's going to bring me back to my building, and it's still not exactly looking like what I thought it would look like. The leases field just says Cambridge Lofts. Well, here's why. We need to tell it what report to display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to customize this form. I could right-click for a shortcut, but we'll show that another day. I'm going to customize this form. I'm going to find the new field leases, my report link. And if you look in the center, you usually don't have to do this either because the relationship just takes care of this. In the center, for the properties of this leases field on this form, we're displaying just a link to the related leases, but that's not what we wanted. We wanted to display them directly on the form, right? So I'm going to switch the radio button. Now I have a drop down that says to base the display on the report. What do I want? Now, ahead of time, I already created a report that I wanted. It's called current leases. And I have a little tag here that says embedded for buildings form. So let's see what that looks like. When I click save, and scroll down, I see my apartments. I see number of current leases. Hey, and I actually see the current leases right here. So some really cool grandparent-grandchild lineage tricks here. So what I want you to do now at this point, if you haven't thought about it already, is reflect on what you just saw here. Is this something that you need? Have you ever wanted reports embedded on your forms to show records from distant tables, grandchild, great-grandchild, sibling? Well, in that case, you might just need to build a report link, and you might not have to directly connect those tables. So let's review really quickly here. Let me go back to my PowerPoint and show here. When it comes to lineage and unnecessary relationships, there are really only two scenarios where you should be relating tables that are distant that otherwise don't need it because of lineage. If your workflow starts at the grandchild table and you want conditional dropdowns, then you can use that unnecessary relationship. If you would actually add a lease to a building for some reason, if someone would actually lease a building itself, then go ahead and build that extra relationship. Or in this case, if you would actually add comments to a project, not just a task, just the project itself, then go ahead and build that unnecessary relationship because it is necessary. Otherwise, you don't need it. And just reflect on how in my example here, I would never need to add a lease directly to a building because I would always be leasing an apartment that belongs to that building. Now, that leaves us with a few topics that we didn't really explore fully, which is, okay, how do I set up that conditional dropdown? And if I want to build other report links from tables that aren't just grandparent-grandchild, how do I do that? If you're interested to learn more about that, my training team is going to be launching some more intermediate training later this summer, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more on building better relationships. So let us know what topics interest you. I think conditional dropdowns is probably a good one to cover. With that in mind, please let us know what you think of this session. Get those questions ready. We'll take a look at what's in the Q&A section now, which I have not looked at yet. We'll see what's in the Q&A and start answering some of these. But again, please, the link for the review this session is posted in the chat. Please consider leaving feedback. Good, constructive, anything in the middle. Otherwise, please enjoy the rest of Empower. Let us know if there is anything else that you'd like to see from QuickBase University and the training team. And thanks for coming to my sessions. Let's open it up for Q&A.